Welcome to another episode of GUR Cafe. I'm your host, Lanie Dixon. I'm beyond excited for today's episode to be joined by the always amazing Steve Bromley. If you're around in the games user research space, you certainly have seen or heard of Steve and his website and book, How to Be a Games User Researcher, which if you haven't picked up by now, I highly recommend. I had the chance to sit down with Steve and discuss how both of our mindsets have shifted over the years in terms of how we approach our reports as researchers and how we've learned to find additional opportunities to build our influence and impact beyond the report itself. Steve had a lot of amazing insights from his experience to share today, so we have a lot to talk about. Grab your favorite drink and let's jump right into today's episode.
There we go.
We made it. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited. We've been chatting a little bit about coming together and having a conversation for a little bit now, and I genuinely have appreciated the conversations we've had so far. So looking forward to it. But first of all, I would be surprised if anybody doesn't know you at this point, but can you please give a little bit of an introduction for the listeners?
Yes, of course. So my name is Steve Bromley. I am a games user researcher. I've been working in the industry for probably a bit over a decade now. First 5 years at PlayStation in their European user research team. That was a really nice place for learning about user research because as a publisher, you get exposed to lots of different team sizes, lots of different environments. I learned a huge amount. The next 5 years of my career has been helping teams of a variety of sizes just get started with user research. So either running individual play tests or helping teams who are interested in it and want to grow their capability inside their own organization, coaching them through it, giving training and just helping teams incorporate user research into how they make games. Some of that and also previous work with the IGDA mentoring scheme led to me releasing a book about games user research.
Yes, love the book.
Fantastic.
Go ahead and plug the book. Let's
will
make
plug
sure
the book.
everybody knows about it.
It's called How to Be a Games User Researcher. And it's a lot of the topics that used to come up repeatedly on mentoring, like, okay, actually, what is the job? How does user research translate to a games development environment? And what sort of experience do I need to get started? And so it kind of wraps up lessons and then puts it on pages, which is it's been a nice experience.
Yes, I love it. I've read the book. It's amazing. I think that as we were chatting about right before we got started recording today, I think there is this necessity for a really nice kind of easy welcome in to kind of what to expect, because I think it can feel very daunting because NDAs and there's a lot of information that can't be shared about kind of what happens in a lot of the day to day. So it can feel a bit overwhelming of like, what is games user research? How do I get there? What does it look like? What am I going to be doing? Do I need this degree? Do I need this? How do I make sure I'm well positioned for what I need to do? And I think you've been doing that writing for a very long time. And I know, as I mentioned, it's something that helped me a lot when I was getting into the industry. So it feels very full circle to bring all of that together today to chat with you.
Yeah, that's really nice, isn't it? A nice journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, awesome. Thank you. Highly recommend everybody check out Steve's book, the blogs, everything. We'll have everything linked in the description for the podcast episode today. But I want to jump into a kind of more specific topic, I guess, that I threw out to you a little while ago to see if you'd be interested. But lately, I've been having a lot of conversations with folks on my team about what I've been kind of referring to as going beyond the user research report. And what I mean here is that, like, can we as researchers find opportunities to provide greater impact and bring influence without thinking our only way of doing that must come from a kind of tangible deliverable itself? And for me, this is all kind of linked closely to past discussions we've had on the podcast where we've talked about being a design tool. And I'm excited to discuss today a bit how we can use that same mindset to think about how we can leverage basically the entire timeline of kind of leading up to, during, and following a deliverable, and the opportunities that come up for us to be able to provide impact and influence within decision making. Because I think that what I've seen a lot with researchers that I've worked with is getting stuck in this loop of, okay, I presented a piece of research, and then you kind of fade into the background until the next request comes up or questions or whatever. And so you kind of have to wait for permission to kind of come in. Um, so yeah, that's kind of setting the scene a little bit of what I want to chat. So I'm going to stop blabbling because I can probably go on. But I think because of your experience and the way in which you've kind of written about topics really related to this, I'm interested in getting some of your perspective because you have such a wide
Mm.
breadth of experience of working with different teams, different levels of seniority. And so I'm going to jump straight in to our very first kind of question that you and I had discussed
Mm.
was, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, okay, before a piece of research, right? So
Mm.
we're getting ready to move into producing a report or a piece of research. We're going to bring in, do a user test, something like this. So how can we how can researchers create a more collaborative and impactful culture with the partners that we're working with surrounding this kind of the insights before the report is written?
Mm. I think it's a great question and a great topic. When I reflect back on my own learning, my own journey in game tutor research, I can see actually for a long time I was making that same error about
Yes, same.
judging based on, hey, my job is to run a great study and make a great report, and I've done that, and I can step back and think, well, I'm fantastic at my job, and think that's the point. Where it was actually, although that is the job description and that's what
Yes.
teams think they want, that real ownership mindset is thinking about, I I'm responsible for the actions a team take as a result of this. And so our real success
Yes.
is being measured on the impact we're having, not our ability to run studies. And I think myself on this journey, I'm still learning this. I'm still working out how do we make that work and how do we make sure that teams are in the place where they can use our research findings, not just can
Yes.
we do a good study. Exactly as you said, that does start before, it starts well before the debrief. If you start thinking about how do we have impact at the debrief,
Mhm.
you have left it much too late.
Yes.
I,
100%.
Usually that first interaction, I guess, with a team is they've come to you with a question. They want to learn something about their game, and they have some research objectives. Will players understand my tutorial? Is the difficulty balance correct? Those type of questions. And again, it depends on your team and their maturity and your relationship and the amount of experience you've had with them on this. But sometimes those objectives can be ill-formed or lack the depth of information that they'd actually need to act on it.
Yes.
So
It's
that I think
needs
that's
versus wants.
exactly.
It's kind of like, if you I see this mistake a lot. I know I made this mistake very
Mm.
early on for a long time as well, where it's like, okay, I'm here. What is it that you want? Like, what do you need?
Mm.
It's a conversation. It's, like, well, yeah, okay, we want to know if players understand the tutorials. Okay, well, what does that mean?
Mm. Yeah, it's a
What are
huge amount.
these? It's There's so many questions. Like, you
Yeah.
can't just leave it at that. And a lot of the times you see people leaving it there, and
Mm.
then it turns out once you kind of deliver your shiny report weeks later, it's like, here they go. Like, they understood, or they didn't understand the tutorial. Okay, but like, maybe that's not exactly what was needed initially. It's kind of, you have to kind of dig and go around that. It's a discovery together.
That's exactly it. There's a huge amount of context those research objectives that you need to know to be able to come to the right to come to helpful conclusion to that team. And that looks it looks casual, but it's just conversations with the team, right? It's
Yes.
asking them for chat about, okay, why are you asking this study? What's important to you currently? What have you done before here? Just getting all that context so that you don't discover in the debrief, exactly as you said, that you're not really answering the most important thing for the team.
Yes.
and that's not the team's fault. They're
No,
specialists in what they know, right? So.
yeah, and I think something that's always been really interesting for me when I've challenged researchers of like, okay, well, is this really what they need right now? How are they going to act on this? It's this, you can kind of tend to sometimes get this fear of questioning. Well, I didn't want to like, they said this is what they want, and I didn't want to like step on their toes by
Mhm.
questioning. And so it's like, oh, okay, understood, right? You don't want to go and be like, why do you need this?
Mhm.
It's the tone, right? And so I think it's encouraging conversation. It's asking questions that encourage, what would you change if you got information about this, and kind
Mhm.
of redirecting the why question, right? And I try and tell my team all the time, it's you're just doing user research. You're interviewing a dev. It's just the same strategy that you would use if you were interviewing a player. It's a funnel. You're trying to get down to that core piece of information that you really want to know. And you want to know why, but you probably can't just come out and ask them why.
Mhm.
So use collaborative language. Use language that helps them get to that. Okay, well, what does this mean? Or how can we work on this? And rather than coming in and making them feel defensive, which
Mhm.
is a lot of people's instinct, like, well, I didn't want to ask them why, and I didn't want them to feel bad. Well, it's no, it's the point is that it's not someone's right and someone's wrong. It is a collaborative conversation around ensuring that you really know what
Mhm.
it is they need, and you can't rely on them to lay out the research questions because that's not their expertise.
I think that's a really nice mindset. Treating it as a piece of discovery research is
Yeah,
exactly right. It's also, especially for more junior researchers or people early in their career, it can be quite scary to ask questions, right? Because you might
100%.
think, oh, I'm revealing my ignorance. I'm revealing that I don't know what's happening in the game. I totally understand that, and I think we have to learn to overcome that. And something that senior researchers can do to help is just model that behavior. Use your position of, well, I'm established in my role, I'm confident in what I'm doing, and show that it's okay to ask teams questions, and show that it's
Yes.
okay to say I don't know, and ask those stupid questions that feel stupid because everyone thinks, oh, this is obvious, but by asking it, you realize that actually it's not obvious, and half the people in the room haven't understood what the logic behind this decision is, or why we're doing that.
Yes.
So it's a really nice thing that people further in their career should be modeling and doing to help with that.
100%. I think that's great.
But yeah, your question was about impact. So yeah, that first step
Yes.
is, well, the first point of it is co-writing those research objectives together, not just taking that from a team and running with it, interrogating it, spending a bit longer understanding the context, and working on agreeing together what position is the team in, what's the most important thing for us to learn next, and then go and do that together. It is
Yeah.
that first step. A lot of relationship building there at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think the key to me, like what you said, is doing it together. It's
Mhm.
finding ways to integrate them into the research, what you're doing, how you're moving forward. I think that there is often also this fear of, well, they can't see behind the curtain.
Mhm.
Like I need to keep the dev team at an arm's length because I don't want them to be making their own decisions or inferring their own decisions from seeing the data or being present in a test or observing or anything like that. And I think that, okay, I'm sure we can all name a situation or a time when this has potentially occurred.
Mhm.
I'm not trying to say that it doesn't happen, but I think in going along with kind of co-creating those objectives, I think it's an interesting way to think about how you can integrate or work with the team,
Mhm.
and that's kind of the starting point. We set the objectives and like how can you work with them, and it's not just, okay, we had a conversation, I'll see you in 2 weeks with your report.
Mhm.
It's the
I
middle.
Yeah, I agree. And depending on the maturity and the experience that your team have had of working with you as a researcher, there are lots of mini opportunities throughout that process to get them involved. You mentioned observation is the obvious and easiest one, inviting your dev teams to come and watch the session to see them live. And I totally understand and also have had that experience where teams see one participant, assume that's representative of, oh, every participant has that action, and immediately jump to taking an action based on it
Yes.
without going through analysis and prioritization and all the things that we would do as researchers. There are a few safeguards, I guess, you can take to address that. Something that with some of the teams I work with, we sometimes start with enforcing until team's maturity has raised, is just setting rules for observation. If you're going to come and watch the session, then you have to have read the research objectives beforehand so that you know what we're learning, and more crucially, what conclusions we're not trying to take from this session that we're about to run.
100%.
And you have to attend the debrief. You have to come to the end and see what's happened at the end and what the conclusions were. They may still run away with their own conclusions in the meantime, but at least you have education opportunities where you can bring them back on track and say, actually, here's the most important conclusions.
I love that. I think it's so nice to include them and set those clear ground rules. I've done that before. I've kicked out people of observation rooms. I'm like, nope, no, this is not the behavior that I'm looking for. But I think it's nice to, and I think I made that mistake kind of early in my career, was withholding some of that information from the team, thinking that it was going to cause them to try and kind of infer their own end results. But what I really found is that through my own personal experience of giving them full visibility, having that meeting, hey everyone, just so we're clear, these are the types of questions that we're going to ask. Here's what the players are going to be doing. Here's the timeline. Here's the schedule. Here's how we plan to introduce them to the content. We're going to have an interview. Here's the questions we're going to discuss in an interview. And it's not to get their approval or input necessarily on the process. It's just to give them some visibility to help them feel, oh, okay, I see how they're going to evaluate this question I had. I feel a little bit more comfortable that they're going to be able to provide me what I want on the back end.
Yeah, and that point about approval is important, isn't it? I've seen researchers accidentally fall into, I'm sending you the discussion guide so you can approve it or give feedback.
Yeah.
Yes, we have domain expertise in this area, which means that we're going to write higher quality questions, presumably. And so we're not after approval, but we're after your understanding. We're sending it to you so you can understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
And during that observation activity, I've also found quite helpful with teams is, as you can imagine, teams are taking their own notes as they're watching sessions because they're seeing things, they want to remember that. As a researcher, especially if you're working in a pair, so you have another researcher in the observation room, you can make that into a moderated activity. You can give them some structure for their note taking. So explain some rules, such as giving them some objectives that they have to look out for and writing notes on post-it notes and then putting their post-it notes in a special section. Things that you can, yeah, it's nice because not only does it give them a thing to look out for so that they're paying attention to the session, they're staying on track with the objectives, but also it's a learning opportunity for you as a researcher.
Yes.
You're seeing what they're thinking and what they're taking from the session. And yeah, sure, they don't have your research expertise and they don't have the background of interpretation that you do, but you're also going to learn a huge amount of their mental models. What do they think about what they're seeing?
Yes. And I think that's what's so important. And I think doing that I love the idea of kind of doing that like actually live during a test, because I think this has always been something that I've tried really to do ahead of a test, sitting with them, playing the content, having them talk aloud, having them explain to me what they see, how they designed something, why they designed it that way, what they're really looking for. And I think I love this kind of combination of that, of bringing them in the room. I say that lot of quotations, in the observation room, and having them, based on the mechanic or the decision that they've specifically designed, their perspective, because that gives you so much more information about how you can think about the report. How are you going to present the findings? How do you discuss whether this is an issue or not? Because maybe that's really going to shape how you think on whether or not this is fundamentally a problem.
Yeah, their priorities are exposed and tremendously helpful. Some teams obviously can't do that live, or there isn't research and observation room. It also works as a wrap-up activity, I think, at the end of the day or the end of a batch of sessions. If you had the consistent observers, before you go and do your in-depth, complex, proper analysis, doing that as a intro activity will just frame what you're going to look out for in your analysis and how you're going to communicate it to the team.
I
I
love
think
that.
it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea, especially when you do have a little bit more of a mature team or a team that you're like working with and you're still kind of trying to find all of your footing. Like it's a good way to kind of introduce these small pieces to kind of help continue to build, understand their perspective, gain that buy-in and that trust and that credibility with the team because you're there, you're understanding the terminology that they're using, which is a huge piece of just being able to provide that long-term impact, right? Is being a good co-partner
Yeah.
to the team and them being able to have the opportunity to explain their concerns of what they saw and not feel like you're not listening or not paying attention because it wasn't the objective or something. It's kind of finding that middle ground a bit.
I agree, and I guess it also makes our stakeholders, game designers, game developers, people we are running research with, um, engage with the research process at a deeper level rather than just
Uh-huh.
watching. They're thinking about it, they're analysing it, and so when it comes to reporting later on, they're already halfway there because they have been reflecting what they've seen through structured activities before they get there,
Yes.
and the reporting just becomes a, well, let's document that thing we learned and let's talk about
Yes.
priorities rather than revelations and new information for everyone.
Yeah, because I think 100%. And I think it really helps if there's a difficult conversation coming, it's a lot easier to prepare for that. It's easier to ensure that you know what you need to prioritize discussing in the report. But this is a good segue. Next question, structure.
Good. Yes.
So I want to discuss a bit about how we can structure this information, right? Like within the deliverable itself, how we can use the structure to our advantage, our presentations and the way that we discuss things to be able to create more of a discussion
Mm.
friendly environment and be able to build that influence as we continue kind of down the road once the report's delivered.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue. Good point about the reports. Um, yeah, and again, reflecting back on my own journey and mistakes that I have made and probably still make on occasion, I guess the temptation is, hey, we have a report template. I've learned 100 interesting things, so let's make a list of 100 If I'm feeling nice, I'll prioritize them. So the big ones at the start and the small ones at the end. But it's just 100 slides of here are 100 issues we learned or 100 interesting findings.
Yeah, shiny
Um,
things.
exactly, which is easy to do for the researcher, but it's again not taking full responsibility for the communication. And will the person listening to this take away the important parts of the finding?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had the same journey that I have. You sometimes reflect on that, you realize that actually it's probably a lot more useful to report 10 things that are important and well communicated than 100 things, than going comprehensive and explaining everything.
Yeah.
And
I think it's
recognize,
it's understanding the time and place, right? It's
yes.
understanding like do we need is it useful to deliver 100 things?
Hmm.
What it like is this the last research opportunity that we're going to have and this team still has several months of dev time that they could work on some of these things? Yeah, load it up.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
give them what they need, prioritize it, try and find ways to chunk it. But yeah, I think I see very often this if people are maybe not entirely confident with the objectives that they had, they feel like they need to fill the pages
Mm.
or they weren't entirely clear what the information they were trying to gather, so they kind of hunt for findings and then they present them as like I found this thing. It's like, okay,
Mm.
but is that related to what we were trying to do? And we all have our formats, we all have our, the logos on here, the banners, the assets and this and that. And I think it's been something I'm sure my team loves me for this, but I constantly try and like take the template away from them.
Mm.
Like, okay, well, and I'm interested in your perspective of what do you think is the thought process of how you should consider how you would structure your report?
Yes, great point. So I think, again, coming back to you have understood the team's context and you understand what's important and those things, like what do they have capacity to deal with. And then from that, I would take a storytelling mindset of,
Yes.
okay, people remember stories, they will stick with them more so than just a list of findings. And so what is the story I want to tell with this report that will be relevant to the team at this point? What are the most important takeaways that I want them to have, or what's the most important thoughts I want them to have, and what actions do I want to take based on that? How that can look in real life is, yeah, cool. Have all your findings, but stick them all in an appendix.
Yeah.
Make some nice decide what the topics or the stories you want to convey are, and they might only be three main points that you want to convey from your findings. Have a section on each, make the section the story, and then just use your finding as evidence for, here's the overarching issue we're talking about here, and here's some findings that are evidence towards it, a couple of points, and then at the end of that section, let's talk about what we can do about it, and let's talk about taking action from it, so that we are, yeah, people remember and take away the right things, I think. But yeah,
Yes.
I guess the ethos is just treating it as storytelling and trying to explain what we're trying to do. Sorry, help the team understand what they need to do next, rather
Yes.
than giving them a comprehensive list of issues.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's easy to I know you've talked about mind maps. Mind maps is
Mm-hmm.
something that I love when doing research. I know my team uses them as well. And sometimes I think when you can become so hyper focused on your branches.
Mm.
When you're just like this issue, this issue, this issue, and then you kind of translating that onto the page can sometimes just feel like separate little buckets of information. And so what I've kind of started doing with my team, like you were saying, is thinking about that story is close the mind map and just write the outline.
Mm-hmm.
What are the most important things that your gut is telling you is important? You can change it later.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to abide by this as like the permanent top findings or executive summary, but write that first. Put it in a Word document somewhere else. Put it on the left side of your mind map or however you use the mind map tool. Just write it what your gut says are the top findings, positives and negatives, and close it.
Mm-hmm.
And then go through, do your findings, get all your pieces together, and start kind of using then that initial framework. And you can use it to kind of confirm or deny. Was I going in the right direction? My gut says there's something here, but I didn't have a finding for that. How do I kind of mitigate that? And I think it's focusing more again on that story, the high level, the themes of what you want to present, rather than throwing all the findings on the page and being like, these two things seem somewhat related. I'm going to write one sentence of how they're related. And you
Mm.
kind of, it feels like this random mishmash of kind of mostly interesting pieces, but pieces.
Yeah, I agree with that. A nice way I had it explained to me very early in my career was, imagine that you got on the lift with the game designer.
Yes.
What is it that you would say? And they asked, "How did that test go?" What would you say to them in the lift? Is probably the amount of takeaways that you should be aiming for
Yes.
with your story. Yes.
Yes. I had one of my cell owners when I was pretty early on doing research on Siege. I We were on a different floor than the research lab, and he was always sitting, waiting, ready for me. By the time I walked from the debrief up the stairs, down the hall, he expected that the elevator pitch. He
Mm-hmm.
expected it. So I had to be like walking really slow, trying to think about what I would say. But it really did force me to just take a moment, take all that information in, and try and at least start digesting it into that story rather than being, oh, well, 7 players did this or 6 players did this thing. It's okay, well, what does that mean? And forcing me to kind of think in those terms. I could change the message later once I'd done my full analysis, but it really got me in this mindset and habit of condensed, the elevator pitch, like you said, like there's like couple of lines. That's about as much information as you need for that kind of real key first ground break of like what you're looking at.
And I know some teams ask for a similar sort of thing at the end of each day, for example. So
Yes.
it's a multi-day playtest. An email at the end just to say, oh, today we saw these type of things, is obviously you haven't gone through the analysis process as you described, but it's a really great opportunity to start teams on that right track, so that rather than having no information, they have some kind of good information from your test. If they observed it, you're influencing what conclusions they're taking from the test. I think
Yes.
summarizing is very valuable in a way we can have a lot of impact before we've written that report.
Yeah. Oh, and I think going back to as well, something that we had both mentioned was this fear of a team taking a decision based on what they saw rather than us kind of confirming or giving that information to them. I think when you do have these like multi-day piece like studies, if you're not providing any sort of debrief, that kind of furthers the chance of someone seeing something on day one and fearing like, oh, I wonder if they're going to have that in the report in a
Mm,
week. And so it kind of helps mitigate, like you were saying, in terms of like, hey, we saw this as well. We're going to further investigate. I always liked to take the approach of this is something that we saw. Here's our follow up questions of what we want to look at, kind of giving them the inside of what we were thinking or what our concerns were that we wanted to follow up with in the data or the next day of touching base with the player in an interview or whatever, and kind of helping them see we're working on it. We
mhm.
saw it too. We saw that thing and we're going to continue to look into it.
Yeah, that's a great perspective.
So I'm curious your thoughts on recommendations.
Okay, great. Yes.
Because we're talking about reports,
Mhm.
what you kind of think about giving recommendations as part of a report.
Yes. As I know you're very aware because we've talked about it before,
Yes.
um, there are two schools of thoughts about recommendations. So I guess just to be clear, a recommendation is we've seen a problem with the game, we've seen an issue, and the researcher deciding to say, here's what I think we should do about it.
Yeah.
One school of thought is that's positive, and a researcher has domain expertise, and that you might have expertise in usability or UX or have seen things in other tests that you can bring to the team, and that's giving them new ideas and part of the service. The other perspective, and probably and actually I'm going to sit on the fence at the end of this.
Are you? I was gonna say, which side are you choosing?
Yes, the other side, as you know, is no, that's not a researcher's job. You're falling into design, and it's going to upset designers because you're stepping on their toes, or it removes you from being an unbiased, neutral participant here. I am more toward researchers shouldn't be doing solutions, but I no, yeah, I wouldn't give solutions myself, but that doesn't mean it's not our problem. And I think that I'm saying correct, and I'm not happy with saying correct. Um, the mindset that I currently have
Yeah.
is to take ownership of ensuring the team come to a solution. So
Yes.
you have seen an issue, you can explain it very well. You can give some prompts for let's think about this or let's think about this aspect. Um, in general design parlance, you might be making how might we's,
Yes.
and then you guide a team through considering that.
Yeah.
You facilitate workshops or the conversations where they understand the issue, they talk about the range of ways in which they could address that, and then come to a conclusion about this is the fix. So I am sitting on the fence. I'm sitting on the fence definitively of let's not write the solution, but let's be responsible for making sure the team come to a solution.
I think that's totally fair. I'm very much this camp as well. So I will join you sitting in the middle on the fence. I think for me, there's a lot of risks for researchers who maybe you're new to the project, you are covering off a piece of research with a team that you don't know as well. Um, if you are not familiar with the decisions that have already been taken, it you can sometimes look a little bit silly if you try and recommend something that maybe has already been ruled out due to technical constraints, time, money, or it's just not the intention of where the game is trying to go. Um, I think for more junior folks, it can be I'm a little bit more reluctant for them to be able to do that. But like you said, I am very much the proponent of prompting,
Hmm.
using them as a way to open up the discussion. I personally, and I say to my team as well, is that using it as a guiding of, maybe we could consider something like this, or how, like you said, how could we do this? How can we ensure this thing? And using it kind of more as a direction of, let's think about this specific mechanic and how it impacts these things. But I think you nailed it, where what helps us build that impact and influence and ensuring that we also are best prepared as researchers is really ensuring that we get to a decision,
Hmm.
and how we can kind of present that information to them to workshop, whether you're the one moderating a workshop with them, putting up stickies on the board. Here's some potential solutions. Let's think through the risks based on what I know about doing research with players. Here's how I can say that some of these things are potential risks, and
Hmm.
discussing if that meets their intention for the design. But I do think at the end of the day, it's our role to be able to ensure we're giving them all of the pieces to be able to take that step towards making the decision. If you're really, really confident and you know that team really well and you've been with them for a couple of years, yeah, I'll give you a pass. Maybe you can give a recommendation. But I think it's the intention behind it, right? I think it's that for me, whenever I was in situations providing a recommendation, it was really tabled as, here's one way we could go about solving this problem. Discuss.
Hmm.
And a lot of the times they would be like, no, we can't do that because of this. But it got the dialogue going. It got them thinking about, no, that's not going to work. Okay, how come that's not going to work? And then we can start to understand the problem space that we're in. But it's just, I'm a bit against just flat out recommendations for everything. But again, guiding that conversation.
Yeah, I agree. It can severely impact your credibility giving a poor recommendation, and
100%.
then all of your fantastic, highly researched, excellent conclusions that is your domain expertise, that are the research findings, are potentially at risk of losing credibility as well, which is
100%.
difficult. For the actual workshop bit, how we used to do it at PlayStation was we would pair that with the debrief. So we
Okay.
would present all the findings, tell a wonderful story, as you can imagine, and then return to the mind map, stick the mind map up on the board, and say, okay, we're going to take the highest priority issues, and now we're going to have a couple of minutes discussion about potential ways to address each. And it wouldn't
Interesting.
be a hard commitment because obviously in the room there's people with a whole variety of domain expertise, and some
Yeah.
people are going to own this, some people just have opinions, and some people shouldn't have opinions. But it creates a space for, let's discuss a range of options, let's get a broad steer on what we could do, and then let's give that an owner. We could say, okay, that top issue looks like actually it's a thing about the UI. We've talked about some different ways to address it. We know this person is in charge of the UI, and so we haven't just debriefed our findings at the end of that session. We've debriefed our findings and put someone in charge of resolving each of the issues,
Yeah.
which I think is a nice hybrid.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's finding some combination of these kind of like next steps or how we're going to move forward, and kind of keeping kind of ownership, or at least kind of ensuring that you can be present from those conversations and provide the context. Again, maybe there's more specific details in a mind map or more kind of lower level information that isn't present in that overall report, or maybe you can reference back to the findings that you had, and ensuring that they really understood the story you were trying to tell them. Um, because I think ensuring that you have kind of that connected impact after the report
Mm.
delivery is just as important kind of as all this other stuff we've been talking about, right? Like leading up to, okay, we did the report and now we're kind of talking about the bounce back of this loop of, okay, we've done it.
Mhm.
Now where are we going with it? Because I think a lot of people's instinct is, I delivered, here you go. Here's
Mm.
your shiny piece of research, and then you kind of again fade away. But for me, this is when like the really interesting, really fun work gets into place, is how we can think about how do we build our impact after that insight has been
Mm-hmm.
delivered.
A lot of the challenges around that are, it's very soft skills based, isn't it? It's building
Yes.
relationships with the individuals. You've understood who's taking responsibility for each of the things that you've talked about, or the debrief, and just checking in with them, whether
Yep.
that's just asking them for a coffee, like having a conversation about how it's going, dropping into the office. Um, it's relationship building, which isn't the hard science bit of the job, but it is equally important to actually have any sort of significant impact.
Yeah. And I think that's what's really um, surprising. I think I've seen that for a lot of people coming in, is that, I'm like, you need to spend less time doing the research and more times talking to people about how you can help them with research.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, whoa, what? I'm like, my stats doesn't help me with this. What am I supposed to do? And I think it is really important to be able to find those ways of, again,
Mm-hmm.
communication, relationship building. And the really great thing is, you don't have to try and come up with a topic, because you already know what topics you can go follow up with them on, because you just wrote a report. And
Yes.
so you can go and you can say, like you said, if you assign, okay, we have this UI issue, we're going to assign it to this UI designer or whomever that's going to resolve this issue. You already know exactly who you want to go talk to
Mm-hmm.
about the topic. And it's really easy to be like, hey, can I grab you for a few minutes? Can we go grab a coffee, or can I poke you later when you have some time? So you're not just like cold calling. You
Mm-hmm.
you have a specific agenda of things that you can go to further leverage the work that you've already done into building those relationships.
What's really nice about that as well is it becomes an iterative cycle. So teams who perhaps haven't had a huge amount of experience of research, or don't know the vast ways in which a researcher might be able to help. They might have some preconceptions about a
Yes.
study looks like this and can only answer these types of objectives. As you start to spend more time with teams, you can notice those opportunities. You can mention, oh, actually, that's a great thing that we could test with a paper prototype. You don't need to
Yeah.
finish making it, and inspire when new tests should be happening, rather than sitting back and waiting for it to come to you.
Yes. I think it's thinking about that as like this, like as a loop. It's
Mm.
always the needs gathering is part of the debrief from the last piece of research, and
Mhm.
it's just this never ending loop. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer to get all the way around, but when you start to think about, yeah, you can be able to recognize, yeah, we can just do this on a paper prototype, or we can ask some internal folks some questions in a really quick play session tomorrow afternoon. We don't need to wait 2 weeks until the build lands and we can do a QC pass. Like, we can do something really quick and easy at our desks. And you might not necessarily recognize those smaller opportunities to get those quick wins
Mhm.
if you're not having those regular conversations with them. You're not seeing what they're working on or how they're evolving from the information that you gave them last week.
I really like how you described it as a loop. Coming back to the beginning of our conversation about the job being based on impact, not just running the
Yeah.
studies. I guess the study is only half of that loop. It's the
Yeah.
semicircle.
Yeah.
And if
100%.
you're only doing taking objectives, running a study, writing a report, you're not hitting that iterative loop, and you're not having the type of impact that you deserve. You need to do that communication bit to make sure it lands and to queue up the next thing,
Yes.
so that you're ultimately influencing the quality of the game at the end of it.
I think it doesn't make it easy necessarily, right? It's not a surefire, like everything's gonna be great. But I think when I realized that mindset for myself, it made it make a lot more sense.
Mm,
Like, oh, I can just use all I already know, like the questions that I can start asking people. It makes it so easy to go and build those relationships with those designers, build the relationships with the team, and think about, how can I potentially start to anticipate the questions they're going to have now,
mhm.
based on the direction or the questions or how they wanted to address the problems from the last test. I'm already writing down what I think are going to be the questions they're going to have, and I can go and I can ask and discuss, like, hey, have you thought about this? Have we if we considered these things, how are we approaching this problem? And you know what? The build looks stable enough. We can probably run a quick test and get you some information on that.
Yes, I agree. Reflecting back on my own journey, it's not easy, the communication things,
No.
but um, it's essential. 5 years ago, if you asked me how am I as a user researcher, I was very good at running the studies and very good at taking objectives and running it and efficiently coming to a great report. And I thought I had user research down. I thought, yeah, I'm an excellent researcher. I'm
Yep.
fantastic at what I do. I get the job. And it's only with time that I've reflected on, actually, no, that's not the job. And that's only doing half the job. And I'm not
Yes.
an excellent researcher. And a lot of my personal growth over the last 5 years has been exploring that side. It's,
Yeah.
okay, how do I create an environment where research does have an impact and can be impactful? And a lot of that is conversations we talked
Yes.
about and relationship building, not just running studies.
Well, yes, 100%.
Mhm.
And I think it's also being able to find opportunities to, I know you had mentioned this when we were chatting last time, was recontextualizing the research we've already done as well. Being able to help understand that not every piece of our impact is delivering a new piece of research. Because I think that for me, I always felt like I had to do something new. I had to
Mhm.
bring something new to the table. I had to bring new information. And that was through bringing a new piece of a new deliverable, a new piece of research. But when you start to spend more time with a team and you're doing pieces of research or you're talking to the researchers around you, you can start to identify that sometimes building those relationships and having impact
Mhm.
is talking about a piece of research that you did a year ago and not actually doing a new piece of research. And it answers questions and it helps, again, close that loop because you've provided and recontextualized that information. And I think that feels like cheap to some people because they're like, oh, well, I
Mhm.
need to like produce something new and wow and flashy and like you have all of these problems. But sometimes it's being able to spend the time to chat with them and understand the questions or concerns and say, hey, you know what? We've asked something similar to this. Let me go back and pull
Mhm.
that. Here's how we can recontextualize it for this situation. And maybe that's the bouncing off point for the needs gathering for the next test. You know, it's kind of like finding it, just being present and
Mhm.
talking with them, getting to know them makes, when I realized that for myself as well, I was like, oh, I'm only doing like half of my job.
Mm. I agree about old research. Like it might not be exactly the questions they're asking
Yeah.
today, and it might just give a clue in the direction in which to go. But without you being there to flag, hey, we learned this a year ago, they would spend the next 2 or 3 weeks, however long it would take you to run a new study, with no information at all and no clue and making decisions based on no information. Whereas if you're there just to flag, here's something we did a year ago that's somewhat relevant, at least you'll point them in the right direction. Or you might be able to do something scrappy, as you mentioned earlier. Let's just add a question to a survey that's going out anyway, or something to increase the quality of the decision making they're going to make. Even if it's not the perfect study, you are helping the team.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I know that you had mentioned this before when we were chatting, when it was this idea of, well, we're there, we're providing something, as opposed to us not being there and there being nothing.
Mhm.
You know, so it's like even if it's not this perfect piece, that doesn't downplay the quality or the impact that it can potentially have. And sometimes it's just even, oh, we know not to ask this question. It may not tell us which question to ask, but it tells us which ones we don't need to or
Nice.
that we don't want to, you know? So it's kind of finding the balance in between can save a lot of dev time and that saves money and that saves time and everything.
Yeah, especially in an environment like game development where it's so time pressured. Teams aren't going to slow down. So if you don't have the answer today, they're just going to make the decision and run with it because
Yes.
they can't wait for a study often. So yeah, you are providing value, saving, increasing the quality of decision making, improving the game through all these things.
Yeah. So I'm gonna get one more question before we run out of time to
Yeah.
kind of close our loop a little bit further is I want to see kind of what your perspective and advice would be for people who are trying to get involved in the decision making process and the discussions that typically follow the report deliverable. What are some ways or some things that people can think about to kind of keep that
Mm.
conversation going?
Good point. And it probably depends on the relationship between you and your team. So some
Yes.
researchers are obviously embedded and spend all their time with their team. Some work in that agency format where
Yeah.
they might not be dedicated to one team all the time. But some of the general principles I'd look out for is, well, starting by asking questions. Ask the people you're working with, where do these decisions get made, and what are the most important meetings to come and join, and then just come and join other meetings the teams are having.
Yes.
Listen to what they're talking about, even if it's not a research related meeting. You will be exposed to, here's the debates in the team, here's the questions they have, here's their priorities currently, all of which is fantastic context gathering for your next study. So that looks like asking questions one to one with the people that you work with or relationships you have already, asking them for recommendations for, okay, what should I be exposed to? What have you written down somewhere that I can read? What
Yep.
meetings can I come to keep up with your team? And I know this is where we started, but it's all just building relationships, isn't it?
Yep.
It's being thought
100%.
of as a credible and sensible team member that is important to keep in the loop with decisions, and then they will come to you, and you will be involved with those decisions naturally because you are part of the team.
100%. I love that. I think it's so powerful, and I saw that for myself, and I see it for my teams of just being present.
Mhm.
Don't feel like you have to show up to a meeting and have information or ask questions or be able to answer questions. Sometimes it's just absorbing that information, understanding, like you said, who are the decision makers? How do they make decisions? What type of information do they want when they want to make a decision? That helps me think about how I can frame my findings, how I can frame my conversations. If I know they're specifically asking for these pieces of information, I can start to think about how I can help, how I can provide the information that they need, the decision makers versus decision validators, and ensuring I'm kind of understanding what type of information and the level of depth I need to provide, or just getting more behind the scenes of what the decisions coming down the road next year or a month from now can potentially look like. But yeah, it's just like you said, being a good coworker, being
Yeah,
somebody that's just present and there and available, and maybe you don't have all of the answers to the questions, but you know what their questions are and you can at least write those down and save
yeah.
them for later.
And the nice thing is you can do that over a coffee. So isn't that nice?
Yes, 100%. uh, we're like really at the end of our time, and I'm sure we could continue going. But thank you so very much. This was a great conversation. I feel like we covered a lot of different things, and I so appreciate you taking the time. I don't know if you had any final words to share or anything.
No words of wisdom. Just thank you for the opportunity. I
Yeah.
I enjoy the podcast. Every, is it monthly? Every edition.
When
Uh,
I get around to it.
yes. I really like that it does give honest conversations about what the job is really like,
Yeah.
and a lot of it reflects my own experience. And so I'm really happy to have been able to join today. Thank you for that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I will be sure to leave all of Steve's info so you can find him, his book, and the blog, everything, his newsletter, which is amazing. If you haven't already registered, I'll leave that information for everybody. And I will see everyone in our next episode, maybe a month from now, maybe less. We'll see. So, thanks again, Steve.
Thank you.